Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're all here today. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you to David Hilton-Barber, whose family roots lie deep in 1820 Settler County, following the arrival of the British settlers. David's maternal great-grandfather, Frederick York Solage, or St. Ledger, was the founder and first editor of the Cape Times. How fitting, then, that David studied journalism at Grahamstown University, where, too, he achieved honours in his BA degree. Although he retired to Zanin, he now lives in Hermanus. He's written 4 books and is busy researching other historical projects. With his knowledge and his experience of how genealogists capture information, I felt that he was the ideal man to teach us points to consider when publishing a family history or a family tree. A warm welcome to you, David, and over to you.
Thank you. I recently published a book by your sister branch in Port Elizabeth, the Eastern Cape branch of the Genealogical Society. And this was the book on the 1820 settlers. And I mention this because we have an Australian listener. A number of orders came from Australia. This is a bulky book. I mean, I don't know if you can see the size of it, but we made up a bulk consignment by FedEx to send to Australia because the international courier for one single book is about 1,000 rand. Anyway, that's by the by. It's a great pleasure to talk to another branch of the Genealogical Society. You people do a wonderful job. I don't think that I'm saying anything new. I'm sure that people know what to do when writing their own story. But as Natalie said, it might be worthwhile considering some of the points that I've discovered in the work that I've done. I'm the publisher. My publishing imprint is Footprint Press. We've got about 25 books in our catalogue, half of which have been written by me. The earliest book was when I lived in Zanin, and we ran a guest house there, and a number of overseas visitors were all interested in the history of the area. So I started putting together bits and pieces of history, and this led to the publication of a book called Footprints in the Lowveld, and that is in its 3rd edition, and it's just shows how easy it is for someone to pick up an opportunity. If you live in an area that isn't well documented, you could write a story about the history of that area. Anyway, let's move on now. This is Margaret Atwood. What a bright, inspiring person she is. Canadian writer who says the past no longer belongs only to those who lived in it. The past belongs to those who claim it and are willing to explore it and infuse it with meaning for those alive today. Now, Margaret Atwood, she writes what is called historiographic metafiction, which is a long word, a term coined for works of fiction which combine the literary devices of metafiction with historical fiction. In other words, she writes a novel which is based on the real events of a person's life. Her books like Alias Grace, The Blind Assassin, are examples of this. We move on to the next one, George Cory, who was a professor at Rhodes, and he wrote, interestingly enough, in a foreword to the book on my ancestors called The Barbers of the Peak, published by Oxford University Press in the 1930s, written by Ivan Mitford Barberton. He's a sculptor and a genealogist. And as I say, Cory wrote the foreword to this book. It is no more than the grateful duty of a succeeding generation to revere the memory of those who bore the heat and burden of the days long gone. But better than merely holding in one's memories of departed heroes is that placing on permanent record the account of their lives and works. Cory, as I say, was a chemist, but he found an interest in the history of the Eastern Province, and he spent his spare time traveling around, covering large areas of the Eastern Cape, amassing an enormous amount of historical data, which eventually found its life in the series of history books that he wrote, and he was knighted for his efforts. We go on to the next one. Now, here is Bill Nasson, who wrote this. Writing about historical events needs to be informative, but don't make it dreary and tight-lipped, nor take it too seriously. If history is to continue to matter, it needs the oxygen of a wider audience. Now, Nasson was educated in the UK. He is a emeritus professor of history at Stellenbosch University, but he was educated in the UK at Hull, York, and Cambridge, and he's had held fellowships in different universities around the world. Right, let's see how far back and how wide one should go. Writing a family history is more than worthwhile. Not only will you research and record the lives of your ancestors, but you will also compile a document that your future family members can use for generations to come. Now, it's interesting that it's only when we get a bit older that we are more interested in where we came from. I talk of this from my own point of view, that my children, who are now adults, of course, but then they weren't interested, and I wasn't at a young age. I didn't know that Frederick York St. Ledger, my great-grandfather, was the founder of the Cape Times. I should have known. I should have actually tried to get a job on the Cape Times. Nepotism, let it reign. But let's go on. Define the scope of your history. You should go back at least several generations, especially if you have an important ancestor whose career has been documented, or if your grandfather kept a diary. Otherwise, just create a story of your immediate family, your parents and siblings, or yourself. One book that I read was called The Saint, the Surgeon, and the Unsung Botanist. The saint being St. Ledger, of course. The surgeon being Gibbon Atherston, Dr. Gibbon Atherston, who performed the first operation under ether in South Africa. My second name is Atherston. We were married into the Atherstons at an early age, and we've been linked ever since. So the unsung botanist was Mary Elizabeth Barber, née Barker, daughter of Thomas Barker, who was a prominent settler. And she was a self-taught biologist and botanist. She was in correspondence with Darwin. She sent enormous quantities of specimens that she collected in the Eastern Cape to Kew Gardens, and she was revered in later years for the contribution she had made. So what I'm saying is that your ancestors are important. They are accessible, and you can combine them with the writing of your own memoir. If your ancestors immigrated, do you want to conduct research about their lives in another country? Rob Smith, who lives in Nottinghamshire, found out that a number of the people in the community had ancestors who were part of the 1820 settlers, and he wrote a book of the Nottinghamshire Party. He compiled a huge amount of information about the people that came out in the Nottinghamshire Party, the Whites, the De Monts, the Atherstons. No, they were there before. So did your ancestors move to another country because of warfare, poverty, and old feud with another family? Interesting things you could find out. So where do you get your information from? Libraries, obviously, national, regional, local, and private archives, newspaper libraries. That's another thing. When I started as a journalist, the library was an important point, an important source of information, because the librarian would manually cut out the newspaper every day and file it under the various subject headings. And any newspaper reporter who wanted to follow up a story would go into the library, and there he would be given the file with all the other material that had been written before by that newspaper. Files of past events, births, engagements, wedding announcements. Today, of course, newspapers don't have libraries. I was horrified, and I came into the Cape Times a few years ago, and I said, I'd like to go to your library. They said, oh, no, we don't have a library. We don't need a library because everything that you need to find out about a previous story, you can get on the internet, or somehow it's stored somewhere. Yeah, legal documents, old letters. That's another thing. Letters, goodness, who writes letters anymore? I wrote a letter to my mother every Sunday for, I don't know, about 20 years. And luckily she kept them. I don't think they were very interesting, but they did cover things that happened to me. And when she presented them back to me, it was interesting. But of course, letter writing is no longer a thing. So let's move on then. When I write a book, I start with online resources, obviously, the internet, websites, the African Studies Library at the University of Cape Town. Now, this tragic picture here shows the fire that burned the Jagger Library. It was horrifying. The fire that started on the mountain the heat was so intense that fireballs were thrown across in the strong winds across kilometers and landed on the roof, and they started combusting, leaves gathered in gutters and so on. It was incredible. There was a very interesting talk given by the Western Cape, is it a genealogical society or the History Society, where they invited one of the people who worked in that library to tell exactly what happened and how they formed a human chain, and they tried to rescue documents and files and boxes and pass them down and get them out. It was a dreadful experience, but anyway. So the Brenthurst Library is the Oppenheimer archive. Very, very helpful. If you make an appointment to go and see them and they ask you what you want to learn about, and you give them a few keywords, when you arrive, there's a trolley they push to you, and in it are about 10 books with markers with those keywords in. That's incredibly helpful. The Killie Campbell Library in Durban, Albany Museum in Grahamstown, all are treasure troves of history. In some cases, at the special editions, special events, the library in Cape Town University, if you want information, they don't bring you the book. They'll say, we'll email it to your address. It couldn't be more helpful. Interesting, your own relatives may be interesting. Your grandmother to speak about her early days, or your old Uncle Jim played cricket against the touring Australian team, or your cousin who you never knew was a secretary to a cabinet minister. These are sources of information. Okay, the first rule in writing, it's quite obvious, is to write well. And writing well, there have been books published by them on the subject, as one that I show here. But hey, the style guide, that's another interesting thing published by The Economist. Each newspaper has its own style guide, which means that it sets out for reporters exactly how you treat words, abbreviations, titles, and you follow the rules, because that is the rule, the house rule. Avoid jargon, strip every sentence to its bare essentials, replace long words with short words, use adjectives sparingly, use active rather than passive words. Most adverbs are unnecessary. Use a dictionary or Rogers Thesaurus. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, here's an example of how adjectives, which people like to use, can actually be dispensed with. If you delete the words in bold, it reads, crowds dancing to music and a drumbeat, beaches, food, hill tribes, this land, people, scenery, food, temples, renowned for its fields, washerwomen, school children. That can be almost as dramatic, if not more so, than with the inclusion of all those adjectives. Okay, the three categories, autobiography, biography, or memoir. Self-explanatory, really. Autobiography is a story all about you, with everything that's interesting included. Biography is an examination and telling of the life of a family member, someone who has an interesting life, with access to a diary, press cuttings, reports, or historical references. But a memoir is really the most important one. It's an account, a historical account written from a personal point of view. Memories that an individual writes about moments or events, both public or private, that took place in his life and in which he might have played a part. So to write a memoir, it's a narrative non-fiction written in a story form like fiction. But a memoirist works with what they've experienced firsthand. It's written in first person from the author's point of view. Dialogue can be included, but since few people can remember precisely every word spoken, the dialogue is not literally true. Instead, the author attempts to recreate it as accurately as possible. First person, present tense, makes what happened in the past become something happening in the present, before your eyes. Present tense makes the action more immediate. I'll give you some examples of this. This is part of a book written many years ago in which the author switches to first person when describing this particular event. I've used this picture, which is just an illustration. It's nothing to do with the actual story. It is sometime in November 1920, and I'm second officer on a tramp steamer, plying the coffee and spice route in the Straits of Malacca. Late one afternoon, the sky darkens, and we know a storm is in the offing. The captain is in and out of the chart room, where he pores over the charts and looks at the barometer. I come in and find him bent over Brown's Maritime Storm Strategy, his chin on his hand. I think this is more serious than we imagine, he says. That's a lovely way of dramatizing that particular situation. Opening and closing. Your first chapter should not be your birth, rather something dramatic. And the closing chapter should be a fitting ending. Let me give you an example of the first. This comes from my memoir. And I make a lot of this up, or I've written it in a dramatic way, but this is exactly what happened. The day father died, shot. The report from a light caliber pistol wiped out all other sounds. Cordite mingled with a smell of dust, hot tar, dry grass, exhaust fumes. Chickens resumed scratching. Father uttered nary a word. From a squatting posture alongside the light delivery truck, he tipped over, his cheek on the ground, dying. It's quite dramatic and yeah, I don't like to think about too much. This is Tito Mboweni, in case you didn't know. I was lucky enough, when I told you about the book I wrote about history of the Lowveld, I asked him, because he comes from that part of the world, he was born near us, if he would write a foreword, and he was happy to do so. And sometime later, he rang me up and he said, he just had a meeting with Jeremy Boraine, the commissioning editor of Jonathan Ball, and he told Tito, he asked Tito, are you going to write your memoir? Tito said, well, he might. So Jeremy said to him, there are two things you must do. One, do it soon. Two, get a ghostwriter. So Tito rang me up one day and he said, would I be his ghost? So I said, yeah, sure, I'll be your ghost. And I spent a lot of time with him recording, he's a very articulate person, recording his recollections, a very interesting person. And he was governor of the Reserve Bank for 10 years. At the end of it all, and this was in the term of Jacob Zuma, he recorded this to me. This is the opening of his book. It was not supposed to end like this, not at all, but it did. I had thought that after so many years in public service, a huge send-off, black tie dinner attended by central bank governors, diplomats, ministers, family, friends, and that we were all going to be entertained by the music of Sibongile Khumalo. No, it was a different send-off. He was disappointed. He was fishing. You know, he's a great fly fisher, and he was summoned to the official residence of the president and told that his term of office was ended, and did he have any idea who should be the next governor? And he was taken aback, but that's another story. We haven't published that book because he keeps saying he's not ready yet. I delivered the manuscript some years ago, and he said, well, he's not ready yet. I'm not sure when he'll be ready, but I'm keeping my finger on it. This is another ending. Sorry, the Tito Mboweni one was an ending, not a beginning, the ending. And this is a book that I wrote on Doug Starling. If a prize were awarded for imagination and the will to bring dreams to reality, it should be given to a man named Doug Starling. He acquired a piece of land about an hour's drive from Leidenburg. Through it gurgled 4 kilometers of a stream called the Spekboom. The valley through which the stretch of the Spekboom runs is exquisitely beautiful. It's a lovely piece of writing by a fellow angler who used to go there year after year. This is another ending. We have started a trust for the church. I was able to get support for my idea to form a layman's trust. We want to use it for projects of our choosing. We have 5 trustees and are busy getting a new one. There are some very wealthy farmers in the area, and I want to get them to put money in. It was the ending of a book. Another ending. The road from Polokwane winds up the mountain after leaving Moria, home of the Zion Christian Church, spiritual haven to over 4 million members. I shielded my eyes against the morning sun that glinted off the white stones that formed the letters ZCC on the hill above the settlement. Home at last, coming home after retiring. This Hunter S. Thompson, he wrote, life should not be a journey to the grave with the intention of arriving safely in a pretty and well-preserved body, but rather to skid in broadside in a cloud of smoke, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, wow, what a ride. Okay, context. When you're writing your memoir, things are happening in the real world that you could include in your narrative. To make your history historical, put it in context with the happenings of the time. Your story surely will encompass some historical event. It would help if you were present or had some or other connection with the event. But even if you didn't, you can enhance the reader's interest by referring to something timeless. As an example, my wife and I were on a holiday at Skopelos, a remote island in the northern Sporades. This provided the location many years later for the film Mamma Mia. By the by, Skopelos, according to the legend, was founded by the son of the god of wine. It was known throughout the ancient Greek cities of the Mediterranean for its wine. My great-grandfather, who was a horse breeder in Craddock, when he died in 1928, an obituary was published in the local newspaper, which I said has imbued in his progeny an inflated but excusable sense of pride. Death yesterday morning removed from our midst at the age of 86, Mr. Hilton-Barber, a South African gentleman widely known, popular, and much respected throughout this country, and whose passing away at so ripe an age will be universally lamented. Wonderful. I really enjoyed reading that. Another context, Sydney, one of my great uncles was a contractor. One of his largest contracts was the construction of the Galuli interchange, built on an old farm in 1968. And now purported to be the busiest interchange in the Southern Hemisphere. But we know that the reason why it was built, firstly, to allow traffic not destined for Johannesburg to bypass the city, but secondly, in that time, to allow for the mobility of the South African army to defend the then apartheid state from hostile neighbors or to quell violence in black townships during a state of emergency. Well, who would have known that? Galuli, goodness. Text boxes and footnotes, these are functions that one can use to give a little bit more interest. Click on references and then footnote, and a number will appear automatically at the bottom. So if you are talking about the Brownie guide law, the footnote is, I promise that I will do my best to be true to my, and so on and so on. That's the Brownie guide law. If you're talking about the Voortrekker movement, you can put in a footnote on what it was all about, or the Dompas. Here are ways that in a text box you can see the footnote comes at the bottom, but the text box is in the text itself. Those are layout techniques that we can use. Editing, it's so important. Yeah, the author always thinks that the text is perfect, but sure enough, there'll be things that need editing. There's a wonderful body called the Professional Editors Guild. You'll pay a fee per 1,000 words. Believe me, it's worthwhile. Any errors in grammar or punctuation reflect badly on the finished product. You can join the Editors Guild if you want to be an editor, or you can use their services, or you can attend their courses. There are many ways that you can benefit from these professional people. So editing really covers things like spelling, grammar, syntax, and usage. Paragraphs too wordy or convoluted, terms likely to be new to readers, wordiness and jargon, factual inconsistencies and incorrectness, gaps in logic, faulty organization. Now, in writing about an event or a person's name, you should really Google that person's name and see if you've got it correctly, or if it's an event, have you made any errors in your description of it. I believe that illustrations are important in a memoir. Some people think that you should not clutter a historical narrative with pictures, but I disagree. Photographs of people, places, events, maps and diagrams, graphics. Of course, cover design comes into it, inner layout, professional quality as far as possible. Printing. Now, it's possible today, in today's technology, to print a few copies of your memoir for your immediate family. Low volume, the quality is great, there's low initial cost, although there's a slightly higher unit price, but you're not landed up with boxes of books in your basement. The process of digital printing is straight from computer to printing press, skipping a number of the steps required for traditional printing. Quick turnaround. There are printers that specialize in self-publishing memoirs and books. No need for a large capital outlay, flexibility. You can put your book together at a very reasonable price if you're only going to make a few copies. To sum up, I've written a book. What's the next step? There's your manuscript. You've had it edited. There's the edited page. You get someone to design it. It's very important. I mean, there's no question. The cover of a book is plays a large part in the selling of it. Batu Batsi was a story that I published, written by an advocate in Zanin, who took a great deal of trouble in writing the history of his people. the Batubatsi people who came from Ghana in the early days, traveled right down South Africa. But not only their story, but their traditions. We've published that book, and it's been quite interesting to see who has ordered a lot of interest in that. Salute the Eagle was a book written by a parabat called Kevin Foss, also very dramatic. And you know, that cover, I think, grabs your attention. The Saint and the Surgeon I mentioned. What happens when a person picks up a book? The first thing he does is look at the cover, and then he turns it over to read the blurb, and then he flicks through it. If you've got his interest thus far, you're on your way to making a sale. Okay, we've talked about that. Price calculator. This is from the website of one of the printers that I use. And they specify that if you use the following formats, it's a paperback, it's that size, that sort of paper, the cover is that board, the cover finish, the page count. And if you want to print 25 minimum, they'll give you a price. And if you want to 250 books, they'll give you a price. And that's like so simple. You have no unpleasant surprises when it comes to paying for the product. Launching the book, it's important, of course, to have to mark the event, to mark the launch, get a guest of honor, send out an invitation list. The venue. We've had books launched at the Book Lounge in Cape Town, which is a lovely venue. Also the Mitre, which is the old boys clubhouse at Bishop's, also a wonderful venue. Or at an art gallery, or interesting places. And like happens, follow-up talks to book clubs, friends of the library, and of course, social media today is very important. This is the end of my story. I've recently published my own memoir, Footprints Along the Way, which I suppose is a bit of a indulgement, if that's the right word. But it tells the story, and I think it's important for my children and their children to learn a little bit about their ancestor, Hilton-Barber. More as a bystander than a participant, I have witnessed 80 years of history unfolding from the bucolic Eastern Cape to the colonial world of Northern Rhodesia, from the politically doomed Central African Federation to the bustle of Johannesburg, from the steamy Lowveld to the serene seaside of the Western Cape. I have failed at farming, had a loving wife after 56 years of marriage, grieved over the premature death of a son and grandson, and made some really terrible choices in my career. But another wedding has redeemed my happiness. So this is the lasting, I suppose, memoir of my life. And I think I just would like to end by saying, write it down. It's a fascinating occupation, and you'll be absorbed. It'll take a lot more than you think in sweat and tears, but it's something that you will be rewarded for in the end. Thank you, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might like to ask.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk, David. I did want to ask you a question about you. You referred to your Atherstone family, and it was quite quick with a reference to the first ether operation. Would that be on, I think it's Frederick Carlisle?
Indeed. He was in Grahamstown, he was the, he had some official title, and he agreed for the operation, but he insisted that he should give the word when the thing should start. And of course, Atherton gave the anesthetic, and when this fellow woke up, he said, "Okay, now you can start." And he wasn't aware of the fact that he'd lost half of his lower leg, in fact, the whole of it. But it was a success. Atherton's other claim to fame, of course, was that he identified the first diamond discovered in Kimberley. It was sent to him in Grahamstown, and a few of them got together and tested its specific gravity and scratched on the glass of the window pane and came up with the idea, yes, this is indeed a diamond. A fascinating character. He was in his way, in those days, if you were an authority on one thing, you happened to be authority on many things. You were not just a doctor, but you were an advisor on cultural matters, and you investigated paleontology and all sorts of things. He cooperated with William Bain in discovering fossils of dinosaurs. But yeah, do you have an interest in the Atherton family? Or
no, actually the Carlisle family, and Frederick is I was aware of the amputation that he had, and that, you know, the record states that it was the first ether operation. So I thought it was kind of quite humorous that you're coming at it from one end and I'm coming at it from the other end.
Yeah, serendipitous is the word.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There was a reference to a book that you used. It was Right Well by somebody, and I was too slow to. I think it was something with a Z or Zits, yes, or something.
Yes, I can find it for you, but I don't know that is the best one. There's so many around, and in fact, you don't need to buy a book. You can download on Google, or you can go to the Professional Editors Guild that I told you about, and they have published a number of pamphlets on editing and on writing, and I think for very little or no outlay, you can probably get all the advice that you would need on brushing up the way you write.
All right, thank you.
David, if there's somebody here in the audience who might want to do their memoirs, can I send it to you?
Yes. What I have, and I'm happy to share it with anyone who's interested, author's guidelines, what you should do in putting together a narrative, a manuscript, and sending it to a publisher. And I also have a standard publishing agreement which sets out the responsibilities of both parties and puts it on a professional basis. And I also ask, when someone is interested in having his manuscript published, to send me a synopsis and 1 or 2 chapters, and then the assessment of the book on my side will take a short while, because I'm a one-man band, and I've got a team that don't work for me, but we are independent people. I have editors, designers, social media people, and so on. We all combine together, but we work quickly. So yeah, those are the points to follow. And the other thing is, I will be ruthless if I don't think it's going to be worthwhile. But on the other hand, I encourage people, because there are self-publishing opportunities where you don't need a publisher. You can get the material edited professionally, designed professionally, and you can, as I showed you earlier, you can have 25 copies printed. That might be the way to go for those people whose work is to my assessment, not marketable in the wider sense. But on the other hand, people who think that this is only going to be of interest to themselves can in fact have a book published. This is another technique that I use. When there's a limited number of copies envisaged, we send out what is called a promotional flyer to as many people as possible, and that includes the author's own contact list, and get people to respond. Would they buy the book? And on that basis, you can determine the print run. And as I've said earlier, a print run can be 25 or 250. So I think the important thing is if you are committed and dedicated to have your work published, you can do it. I think there's so many lost opportunities when grandmother dies and nothing has been recorded. You blame yourself that you didn't take the opportunity of talking, listening, and writing down, and so on. So anyway, the quick answer is whatever you have in mind, just let me know and I'll see if I can help you.
Could I ask something, please?
Yes.
Can you please tell me, if you don't really want to write a book, you just want to write on a computer program, what program does one use? Do you have to buy a special program? Can you use the MS Word or Adobe Acrobat? What should one use?
I have a rule that everything that we deal with must be on Word. If your computer has Word as an option, that's what you use. The author's guidelines, which I mentioned, will cover all of those things. And if you send me an email, I'll send that to you. It sets out what you should do in paragraphing and in word spacing and the font you should use and all of that stuff.
Good day. I have a question to you, sir. I'm in Namibia, and I've completed my I don't know if I should call it a memoir, but it's completed now. I'm at the end. I've been using Grammarly. Is that okay?
Yes. Grammarly is a very good editing app, and it tells you where you should correct certain things. I also have a number of different ones that I use. Editor is the one that I have on my computer, but it puts a query on anything that looks a little bit dodgy, and you can correct it. But yeah, you can't go wrong with Grammarly.
Okay. And the other thing is, someone told me I would need to do a virtual launch besides doing the physical launch, which I will invite my people or whoever I want there. And then because my book, it's going to the families that are involved. They are not only South African. Oh, they are South African from the offspring, but they, a lot of people they are now in Australia, New Zealand, all over. So they said it would be best for me to do a virtual. And yes, I think that is all I wanted to know.
Sure. No, a virtual launch, this medium of launching became obviously very popular during the COVID lockdown. The advantage, of course, is like we have now, we've got people from all over the world. And books that I've published, written by authors in Canada and Australia, it's wonderful to be able to get everyone together, talk like we are. So virtual launches are important, but a physical launch is also good. There's nothing quite like getting people together in a bookshop or a nice venue and having a guest speaker and having a bit of an event, a bit of fun as well. So yeah, you can do that.
What I've had in mind is because the Dutch Reformed Church is where most of the family come from, and I thought of just promoting like what you did now, saying there's a flyer and giving them out before printing, in order for me then to see how many people will
Yes.
be interested in my book.
Yes, that's a good idea. Take the trouble of having what we call a persuasive promotional flyer designed with the cover of your book and some, quite descriptive account of what's in it, and get people's interest. You've got to grab the interest, and put in a price and say, as we do, special pre-print special offer, pay now. That's a thing. We're going to give you the opportunity to buy the book at a special price before we print it. You can use something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Matthew Bodie writes, "Hi David, thanks for your illuminating presentation. I was wondering whether you have any advice on eliciting family anecdotes from reticent relatives. He is loath to exclude the stories of otherwise interesting relatives whose descendants appear unwilling to share."
Yeah, well, I'm afraid that's not one that I could answer, but I find that reluctance on the part of a person to tell his story is often modesty. And if you assure him that you would make it interesting, that you are interested, and in any event, whatever you tell me, I'm going to put it together and I'm going to show it to you afterwards. And I'm sure doing it that way, you can often get over initial resistance by listening and encouraging the person to, well, what are your worries about this? Is this a problem here? People are reluctant to involve or to tell stories that might reflect poorly on them or on other people, and you must overcome that. And I think training as a journalist is a help, because after what you do, you are a listener and a recorder, and you're not necessarily putting your own viewpoint. So I find that most people that I speak to, they are interesting if you delve deeply and you find something about their special interests, their history. You can overcome a lot of that reluctance.
I hope that answers your question, Matthew. There's another one here from Nikki, who asks, any suggestions on printers that would do fewer than 10 books for self-publishing?
Yes, I have no hesitation in giving the name of the printer I use, Pinetown Printers, in Pinetown, obviously. They have a special division called Burble, B-U-R-B-L-E, Burble Books. And Ryan, who runs that division, will give you chapter and verse on, as I showed earlier, if you follow all of these specifications that I set out, he'll give you a price on the turn, and you'll know how much you're in for. But yes, they do small run prints for individuals, like weddings, special anniversaries, where you have 25 pages or 50 pages with color. Whatever specifications you give, you'll have a price. But there are other printers that do this, but I just have the experience over the years of these people, Pinetown Printers.
Thanks, David. Angela Hausler writes, what are your thoughts about starting with an ancestor who has a particularly well-known event occur in his lifetime, then moving back in time to his parents, and then coming forward to his offspring?
Yeah, I'd go along with that. I'd like to start with a fairly dramatic, interesting event. It could be anywhere along the line that grabs your attention at the beginning, the opening of the book. is important. And by all means, if you have an ancestor who has made some significant contribution, that's a fine way to start. And you can go back and forth as you go along, hark back to other events.
There have been books written about my family, and the facts are incorrect. Do I correct them, or do I just tell my story?
Well, I'm not sure. The author of the book on your family is the first person that you should engage with, not in a belligerent fashion, but to say, hey, I don't think this is quite right.
Sorry, if I could just interject. You know the book very well that I'm talking about. It's a book by Gugu Thompson. Well, not by, from Gugu.
Yes, I know the book very well. About
okay.
Now, he's got a very
yes.
Yeah.
Now the 5 deserters, if you remember, they deserted after Sekakuni.
Yes.
Never existed. They actually, if you look at the 5 of them, well, 2 of them were married into my family. The one being James Smith, the carpenter, who did the furniture for the Union buildings.
Mm.
The other one being Woodward, John Frederick Gray, who was a wagon maker. They came up with my family from Dordrecht in the Eastern Cape in a trek. They were never deserters from the army.
Okay. What I would suggest is that you write your book.
Okay.
And that you use as much material as you wish with acknowledgement to the previous book on Gugu Thompson.
Okay.
But add at the beginning, you have an author's note, which sets out the reason why you wish to publish this book because of some misrepresentation, but provide as much information about the people, the wagon maker and the furniture maker. There's a lot of interest in that. Did you live in Heinesberg?
No, never.
I lived in Zidane for many years, and Heinesberg was a favorite haunt of mine because up in the mountains there, it's got a certain allure.
I've been there quite a few times, and every time I've gone up there, I've met with Louis.
Yes.
And a lot of my research with Louis.
Yes.
We went up about 3 weeks ago, and we found my great-great-grandfather's farm, the ruin of the farm, on a property called Patata Hoek, which was right next door to Hubert's Kroon. I've done a hell of a lot of research.
Well, it's certainly worth putting together. Louis, of course, is a great fount of information himself. He is the emeritus professor of history from what used to be called Turfloop. You know, when he retired, they stopped history as a subject at the university. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
And Louis has got a house in Heinesberg, which every room is stacked from floor to ceiling with books. He's got about 3,000 books. What a character. I've been on a couple of road trips with him to launch books that we worked together on. And he's a fascinating character. You heard about the walk he did from Mozambique to Petersburg to mark the thesis that a friend of his had writing about a Jesuit priest who did this walk many years ago. So Louis did the same thing.
Yeah.
Dressed in a white robe. And, what a character. Anyway, by all means, put your stuff together. I'd be very interested in cooperating with you on that. I've
just found the history of Heinesberg and the whole area so fascinating. I mean, my father died when I was 9 years old, and I only met my grandfather twice. And I didn't have any idea of where I came from. And when somebody told me about Woodbush and Heinertsburg,
Yeah.
I'd never heard of these places. And
Yeah.
I've lived in South Africa all my life. But it was absolutely fascinating to go there and find out the history.
I wrote a book, a very slim volume, Footprints in the History of Heinertsburg. And
You
although it's
sent
out
it,
of print,
you sent it to me on Word last week.
oh, so you are the, okay, no. Now we're getting together. You know, you must tell me your name before you start. I might get embarrassed by telling the same story. Okay. All right. So we're on the same wavelength now.
No.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
But I just wondered how you stand with other descendants who may not want certain issues revealed or published. You know, do you have to contact other family members to warn them you're intending to do such a book? Where do you stand on that legally?
I think that you're entitled to write about your personal knowledge, understanding of your family. If there is something that you think would be offensive, you might ask them or warn them in advance or give them advance notice of what you want to say and say, is this okay with you? But generally, I don't think that you need to be apologetic or to be beholden to anyone to write what you want to write, as long as you stand by the accuracy of what you're writing.
Yeah.
And if it's a myth or a family story, as long as you present it as such, you can't be accused of false facts. So I don't think you need to get advance information from other members of the family, unless you want to expand the narrative and they might have something to add. That's another story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think we're going to have a problem to be dramatic in the start of our books. We are genealogists. We all have stories. Natalie, just unmute yourself. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was going to say, are you going to write collectively a book by the members of your branch, like the Eastern Cape people did?
No, I don't think so.
You know, you could choose a topic, and everyone adds a chapter, put together an omnibus book on a particular event or time. Yeah, that's a thought.
It is a thought. It's an interesting thought. Perhaps we could start with the skeletons we know about. I wonder how many new members that would garner. I wonder. It's a great idea. Are there any other questions? David's been shielding questions for over half an hour, and it's slightly longer than your presentation, David. It shows the interest. It shows the interest for sure. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hear from Mark B about Heinertsburg, and I'm going to have to purchase a book called, what was it? The History of Heinertsburg.
Well, the one that I mentioned is out of print, but if I use my own advice, I can get 3 copies printed at not a great cost, and I'll send you one with my compliments.
Thank you. I gratefully received. Gratefully received. All right, if there are no other questions, David, I must say again, it's been a fascinating hour. Really, really it has. And I think if anybody publishes in the next year, maybe we should have a follow-up just before they do that. And yeah, thank you so much for a fascinating afternoon.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.